All right, I am so excited for today's episode of the show. With me, I have Carol Anderson, who is a Utah based data scientist and machine learning practitioner who works on AI ethics and risk management. She's an officer at the nonprofit AI Risk and Vulnerability Alliance, and formerly, she was an academic molecular biologist. Carol, that is such a cool resume and title. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Good. Good to be here.
Amazing. So, where are you from?
So I'm originally from California, originally from Southern California, but I lived for a long time in San Francisco and ended up in Utah because of a job at Ancestry.com, which is headquartered in Lehi. So they also have an office in San Francisco, and I was hired there and then had the opportunity to keep the same job but move to Utah. And I've always loved Utah. I ski and hike and do other outdoor stuff. So I took the opportunity to move here and I just love it.
Yeah. How does it compare to living in California?
Oh, it's just so much less stressful.
Yeah, I can imagine. Living in San Francisco would be tough,
Yeah, I mean,
although it
I
would be
loved a lot of things
fun.
about it too. Yeah, I do miss some aspects of it, but yeah, I love Utah and just the access to the outdoors is amazing. I think it's one of the best places to live if you like mountain activities.
Agreed. It's so nice to have the Wasatch Front so close, rising up from the
Mhm.
city, and just all the trails and opportunities that that presents. So,
Yeah.
what drew you to this field? Like, how did you get into it?
hmm Yeah, well, so I was in academia for a long time and, was in a faculty position as a molecular biologist, but kind of decided that that wasn't for me. And then I went into data science, which is a pretty common pathway actually for people with quantitative backgrounds. At that time, it was pretty easy to make the transition from academic research into tech as a data scientist. Um, and I've enjoyed working as a data scientist, but I sort of got to a point where I wanted to do something more aligned with my values. And so a couple of years ago, I left my most recent corporate job as a data scientist and transitioned into focusing on issues around AI ethics and safety and basically trying to prevent AI and algorithms from harming people.
Yeah, that's such a timely and powerful topic. And where did you go to university and what's your degree in again? Just to remind me.
Yeah, my undergraduate degree, it's from Yale, it's in chemistry. And then I have a PhD in biochem and molecular biology from UCSF, the University of California at San Francisco.
Awesome. Awesome. Was it like my one of the places my brain goes is just how underrepresented women are in STEM. And did you find
hmm
that like is that changing or
hmm
is that changing? And then I'd also love to hear your tips for women that are in these male dominated fields because as you know, running for US Senate, that's
Yeah,
70%, 75% men, three and four.
yeah.
So yeah, I was
hmm
if you could speak to if you don't mind, yeah, love
Sure.
to hear
Yeah,
more.
yeah. Yeah, I know that's a topic that I think is really important to talk about. Um, Yeah, so as a biologist, actually, like in the sort of lower levels of molecular biology, it's actually quite gender balanced. And so that whole phase of my career, in retrospect, it was like this blissful time when I didn't actually think about my gender at work. I just felt an absolute sense of belonging there. But that started to change, when I had a tenure track faculty position at Indiana University, and the in that department, I was one of very few women, and it was a supportive environment, but still, I became uncomfortably aware of my gender, um, and then that was really also a very striking change when I went into tech,
Mm.
because yeah, the gender imbalance, as you know, is it can be pretty extreme in tech. And I feel like my experience in tech has been there's been a series of small experiences where it's nothing that I want to lodge an official complaint about, but like a series of small experiences where I think like, I wonder if I just got stereotyped or, just got underestimated because of my gender. Um, and it's really hard to know, for any individual case. Um, but just like to give an example, well, by way of background, there were some researchers that did a study several years ago where they got performance reviews from tech employees, and they did some analysis of those, and also looking at the gender and race of the employees. And they found a lot of really interesting things, but one of the things they found was that women were much more likely than men to receive feedback about their personality,
Mm.
and men were much more likely to receive actionable feedback about how they could improve their performance. Um, and this has happened to me. I have received feedback about my personality in a performance review, and um, other female teammates have as well. And I don't know for sure that that was because of my gender, right? Like maybe my personality flaws are so significant that I would have received that feedback either way. Um, but I think that's an example of how, there are these things that happen where it feels like, I wonder if I would have had a different outcome if I had been male, but you never really know because most of us haven't done the experiment of living as another gender.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot. And I think it's really interesting that timeline you talk about because when you're a little girl or even in college, you believe you can become anything you want. And then it's only
Hmm.
like as you get further and further along, trying to reach the higher levels of leadership, I feel that
Hmm.
these forces become stronger. And I remember I was taking a high level avalanche forecasting class and snow science. It's another kind of science. And
Hmm.
my evaluation said she talks when she should listen.
Oh,
And it's like, I don't know how to, it was very subjective,
yeah, yeah,
it's hard to act on that. And it's also hard not to
yes.
take that personally. And like,
Hmm.
it took me a whole year of like stewing on that before I did file an official complaint and it
Okay.
didn't get anywhere. But,
Yeah,
it,
that's like straight off of the list that these researchers found. Like the comments were like, she needs to step back and let others shine, or she's too sensitive, she's too aggressive, she's got sharp elbows.
yeah. So, I mean, it's really frustrating the kind of things that you encounter. And then how have you kept, like, for me, I was trying to become a mountain guide, and that was one of the prerequisites to getting into the guiding program. And it was enough
Mhm.
that it made me decide to not become a mountain guide. And so, how
Yeah.
have you kept going? Because I get this question too from a lot of people, and I'm like, it's a hard question because
Yeah.
there's times that those things just make you like they make you feel like you should be doing something else. And so, I've heard from other
Hmm.
women that they've had similar experiences, like in the mountaineering and guiding world, that have made them
Hmm.
one woman became a realtor. So,
Hmm.
like, kudos to you for continuing to persist because it's not easy. And do you have any tips
Thanks.
or things that have helped you?
I'm not sure if I actually do. I have left corporate tech, and I think, probably in part because of these issues. And I think I probably am not going to go back to corporate tech.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't have the secret sauce, but I guess what I do want to say is that I think companies can do a lot more.
Mm,
And it's really not on us, the women, to solve this problem, right?
yes.
Um, and in my observation, a lot of companies are approaching this by trying to increase the diversity of their hiring. And they are putting a lot of effort into hiring a more diverse workforce, but they don't really seem to be doing very much on the cultural level to improve the culture inside companies, so that people would feel like they belong.
Mm,
So I would really like to see companies put more focus on that.
yeah. Yeah. And I think the other part too is that the leadership needs to also be more
Hmm.
diverse because it's a different power balance if you have a bunch of employees, but all the managers are still like
Hmm.
men. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's much harder if you don't have more people from different backgrounds and different genders at the top. So I
Hmm.
think that's another part of it. But thank you for speaking to that. I know it's
Hmm.
often uncomfortable to talk about, but I just
Yeah.
started to think about it and I'm like, oh, I bet she's got some good insights. So thank you very much for sharing that. And
Yeah.
I wanted to dive into now the algorithms part
Hmm.
because I'm so fascinated by what you do. And I think as algorithms now play a bigger and bigger role in our lives, can you speak and just give us a broad level? What are algorithms?
Sure. Yeah. Algorithms are just any set of instructions that gets expressed as code. So it's actually a really, really general term. And I think a lot of people use it specifically to talk about the algorithms that are driving our social media content feeds, but it's actually much broader than that. That's just sort of one specific type of algorithm. So it could be even something as simple as just like add two numbers and print out the result. That's an algorithm.
Interesting. And so, what are the ways that algorithms and the kind of data science you do, how do they touch our lives?
My specific area of focus is machine learning algorithms, which are they're algorithms where they're not designed completely by a person. They're sort of partially designed by the programmer and partially learned from data. Um, and these types of algorithms are just ubiquitous. So, I mean, it includes things like our spam filters, the classification systems that classify spam or not, recommendation systems like in our social media feeds or on Spotify, facial recognition, object detection, like when self-driving cars are able to detect pedestrians or stop signs. Um, there's risk scoring systems, forecasting, the list goes on. So it's really touching every aspect of our lives.
And what is algorithmic fairness?
Yeah, I think it's easiest to talk about that by talking about its opposite, which is algorithmic bias.
Hmm.
Um, so I can give a couple of examples of algorithmic bias. Um, so one example is this is an incident that happened in 2014 and 2015 at Amazon, where Amazon, a team there developed a system for sorting resumes. So they wanted to be able to take all the resumes from applicants for specific jobs and then rank them so that they could sort of, sift through and identify the highest priority candidates. So they were using, a form of machine learning to match resumes to the job description. And they found that this system, it turned out it was downranking resumes of women applying for technical roles.
Hmm.
And they haven't shared a huge amount of detail about what happened. This was like reported by journalists, but it seems like what happened is that they had used resumes from Amazon employees of the past 10 years to train their ranking algorithm. And it looks like the algorithm learned to prefer resumes that were similar to the people who had been hired in the last 10 years, who were mostly women. And the system didn't actually know the genders of the applicants, but it turned out it was picking up on these cues, like if somebody mentioned a women's club on their resume or the name of an all-women's college, or even there were patterns of word usage that were kind of gender specific. Like men tended to use words like captured or executed on their resume. So the system was preferring that. And so
Interesting.
this is, I mean, this, and I'm not saying this as a Amazon is evil story. They actually really deserve credit for having tested their algorithm and identified this problem and taken it offline. But I think that's it's a good example of how bias gets into these systems. So it's perpetuating the historical bias that was in the training data.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, so how can more companies and programmers ensure that we have more fair and just algorithms? And yeah, how can we work to eliminate this bias when these,
Mm-hmm.
especially with machine learning, with all these things becoming so much more ubiquitous?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think there are a couple different layers to the answer there. So one layer of it is the technical fixes. Um, so, as that Amazon story illustrates, it is possible to test your algorithms for bias.
Mhm.
And then it's also possible to do technical mitigations. So to debias the data or debias the algorithm. Um, so one thing is that, the teams that are building these products should be doing those tests. Um, and then implementing fixes. Now, I think another layer to the question, though, is like, how do we, at a large scale, make sure that teams are doing that? Um, and I think there's no easy answer, but I think there are a few different things that we could talk about or that we could consider. So one thing is transparency requirements. So we're in a situation where companies really don't have to disclose what algorithms they're using or how they work, and even some levels of government don't have to disclose that. Um, and so I think it could be helpful to implement some transparency requirements where, at least in use cases that are impacting people's rights or their access to basic services like housing or public benefits, that companies or governments would need to disclose when they're using an algorithm and maybe some details about it, or possibly even giving access to researchers for testing.
I mean, I think that transparency part is really important. And I mean, do you think that like where my brain goes when I think about algorithms is I just think about how it creates like such echo chambers on social media too, because it's like,
Mm.
oh, because you liked this, you're gonna like that. And then it just serves you things that confirm your maybe it's a bias or maybe it's
Hmm.
something that you're, a leaning. And when we look at that, like on a larger scale with the increasing
Hmm.
political polarization that we're seeing today, um, like I can't help but think, like when I look at an issue, like I try to research all the different angles. Like I try to look at what everybody's saying about it so then I can better create an argument to deflect or to counter what the other side or what other people might be thinking about it. And so, yeah, I guess like how do you think that affects our increasing polarization and is there a world in the future that we can opt out of that?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and here I'm kind of speaking more as just a concerned citizen, because my social media isn't my area of expertise. But yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is this concern around the fact that the algorithms, the social media algorithms, are because they're trying to optimize for engagement or time spent on the platform. There's this incentive to create more and more outrageous and polarizing content.
Right.
So there's the polarization, and then there's also the fact that because our feeds are different, we no longer really have this like shared reality that we're all working from. Um, and there are technical fixes for this. So there's a whole area of research, where people are finding ways to make these algorithms less polarizing.
Mhm.
But I think there's also this issue where the incentives aren't really there
Right.
for social media companies to do that. And I don't think there's a lot that the government can do here because, they're private companies and they're free speech issues. Um, but I guess, one thing that I think could be something that we as consumers could do is be open to the idea of a subscription-based social media platform. Because I think that part of the problem here is the fact that the revenue is coming from ads. That gives the platforms incentives to make highly addicting products and keep us on the platform so that they can show us more ads. And if we were paying for a subscription, then the incentives would be better aligned because in that case, the user is the customer instead of the advertiser being the customer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been thinking that too. Like, it would be so nice if we could opt out of, it would be, I think, really good if we could opt out of the whole algorithm and just see a chronological feed and use it as a way to
Hmm.
connect with our friends and family. And like, occasionally you do see your uncle and you see
Hmm.
like, I think it's important for us to understand all the sides of an issue. Like there's always more than two sides to an issue. Like I sometimes don't like the framing of both sides because there's a
Hmm.
lot more ways to look at an issue. But I also think about it too with like how Google has gone when you type in a search and now instead of seeing the web results, you're seeing like a curated
Hmm.
kind of
The
page.
AI summary kind of thing.
Exactly. And like that
Hmm.
concerns me a lot because like how can we do any more like independent research and
Hmm.
especially when you think about the role of consumerism and capitalism and like feeding the advertising machine, I think that's where it gets really messy.
Hmm.
So thanks for speaking to that. It's something I think about a lot because it concerns me that it feels sometimes like we're living in a post-truth society and people can just say whatever they want and there is a truth. Like there is a reality and there like traditional media they used to do a lot of, I mean, they still do a lot of fact checking to make sure
Hmm.
that people's claims are legitimate and truthful. And so
Hmm.
I'd love to see a world where we can get back to having more ways to fact check and
Hmm.
to find more of an objective reality behind
Hmm.
claims and things that people are making.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that too, and especially seeing how just the quality of search results that you get on any search engine is going down because of the proliferation of AI generated material on the web.
Mm.
And it almost feels like we're going to have to go to back to a time when uh, things on the internet are just hand curated. Back in the day before we actually had good search engines like Google, there were sites where you would go and browse for information, and those the links on those sites were actually like hand selected by people. I actually knew
Mm.
a couple of people when I was, living in San Francisco back in the 90s whose job title was web surfer, and they would curate these links. So I've been wondering lately if, we need to go back to that kind of a model, or some kind of like walled garden situation where, you pay for access to content that, is somehow curated for quality.
Yeah, no, I think that that's true. I think about the library and like going and doing
Yeah.
research at the library,
Yeah.
finding the topic and looking through the catalog and finding the row and the aisle where your research materials would be. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just it's a bit concerning for sure. And do you have any recommendations for like, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I've been so disappointed with Google as a web browser. Like, are there better ones that
Hmm.
you know of that we should be looking at using to do more, to do better research?
I recently experimented a little bit with a paid search engine, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it. Um, but it was explicitly trying to solve this problem. And I didn't play around with it enough that I could say, yes, this is a lot better. But I think it's a good concept and something that, yeah, I would like to explore more.
Absolutely. Because it's like now when you type something in on Google too, the first five things that come up with that really little disclaimer are sponsored. And I'm like,
Hmm.
no,
Yeah.
I don't want to see. And it's so easy to click on that and think that it's
Hmm.
actually what you want,
Hmm.
especially with how fast people are going and with a lack of digital literacy for some folks. I mean, it's not something I hope it's still, I mean, in university, like you learn how to do that kind of that search, but they make these disclaimers now, the sponsored so small, like it's really
Hmm.
hard to know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes, I've gotten caught by that too.
I know it's so frustrating. Well, maybe we can go on now. I know you touched on this, but can you talk a little bit more about machine learning and AI and generative AI?
Yeah, definitely. I also did want to sort of circle back to your previous question, when you asked about how can we eliminate bias. So
Yeah,
there were like a couple of other things that I wanted to touch on there.
please.
Um, so another possible intervention that people are experimenting with in different places around the world is impact assessments. So for AI or algorithmic systems that touch on, basic rights, or access to services, they're requiring that there be an impact assessment done before the system is deployed.
Mm.
Um, and so that's something that I think we could think about doing here. And then another approach is algorithmic auditing. And so New York City actually has recently implemented the first law in the United States that requires algorithmic audits. And they're specifically requiring them for what they call automated employment decision tools.
Mm.
So these are, it's software used in the hiring process. It could cover a lot of different things, but probably the most common example is resume ranking systems. So most companies, of mid to large size, use something called an applicant tracking system in their hiring, and that handles all of the incoming applications and the scheduling of interviews and so forth. And most of those include some kind of resume ranking system. And so, as we were talking about earlier with the Amazon example, that's a place where bias can creep in.
Hmm.
So this New York City law is trying to require a bias audit for these kinds of systems. Um, it went into effect just about a year ago, last July. Um, it actually, there's some flaws in the way that the law is written. Like the scope of it is written such that a lot of hiring tools are, companies are able to argue that they're not in scope for the law.
Hmm.
And there's some other flaws with the law as well, where I think people that are studying it closely feel like it hasn't been very effective. But still, I think this approach of algorithmic auditing has some promise, and it is something that we should be thinking about as a possible policy intervention.
No, that's really interesting. Did you think those could be implemented like nationally or is
Hmm.
larger scale?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think they could be. I think that, the New York City law has shown us that designing this well is very tricky. So I
Mm.
think maybe there is some merit to the idea of trying it on a smaller scale and sort of, using that as a testing ground to try to figure out how to write these laws well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, are there other places that are working on this? Because it seems like such a big
Hmm.
issue and it seems so
Yeah.
problematic in a lot of ways. And it's just, I don't necessarily see a lot of members of Congress or folks
Hmm.
that as concerned about it as maybe we should be.
Hmm. Yeah, so the EU like really stands out as probably having done the most on this. The EU AI Act, which was recently passed, it does require impact assessments for high risk AI systems. Um, Canada actually requires algorithmic impact assessments for some systems, and yeah, there are various places around the world that are trying out different things. And here in the States, things are happening on the state level as well.
Great.
So there's sort of a patchwork, and everything is like very early days still.
Well, it's I one small thing I really appreciate that the EU did is the USB-C thing on the iPhones, to make it all standard.
Yeah.
And I mean, as much as we don't want the government telling companies what to do, that is a real simple one that will eliminate a lot of
Hmm.
waste. So I've been really enjoying the USB-C charger and not having to bring the lightning anymore. Although I still have a few things that need lightning, so I'm still bringing the cords, but hopefully in a few more years we'll have phased that out. So let's go back to the machine learning and AI and generative
Yeah.
AI. If you could just give us a quick
Mhm.
rundown of those.
Sure. Yeah. So machine learning refers to types of algorithms where they're not fully specified by the programmer. The programmer sort of decides the general form of the algorithm, but then the details of the calculations are learned from a set of data. So, just to make it more concrete with an example I like to use is, let's say I'm a data scientist at a bank that grants loans, and I'd like to have a way to predict for a new loan applicant whether they're likely to repay the loan. And I might have some information like their income, their credit score, and the amount of the loan. And let's say I have a historical data set. Maybe I have, for the loans that my bank granted for the last 20 years, I have all of those pieces of information, as well as whether the person ultimately repaid the loan or not. So I could use that historical data set as training data for my algorithm.
Mm.
So the algorithm would learn patterns in that historical data. And then once training is complete, then I could put in for a new applicant their income, their credit score, the amount of the loan. And then this algorithm will spit out a probability of them repaying the loan. So that whole process is machine learning, and then we also call the final algorithm a machine learning model or just a model.
And then how would you describe AI and generative AI?
Yeah, AI is a term that people are using in a lot of different ways, and the term is evolving. But I think for me and a lot of other people in the field, I use it pretty much interchangeably with machine learning. So AI systems are systems that are based on machine learning. And so that includes, all the types of systems that I mentioned earlier, facial recognition, object detection, classification, ranking and scoring, forecasting, and so forth. Um, and then generative AI refers to models like ChatGPT, large language models, or image generating models like Stable Diffusion or DALL-E, or other kinds of models that generate content. It could be a music generating model, for example.
And how do you think, like right now, a lot of this stuff is sort of in its infancy. And so,
Mhm.
how do you see the growth of AI and how it's going to what it's going to do in the future. I know
Oh,
that's a big question. Or like
yeah.
maybe and then even just in the last year, from the first chat GPT to what we have now and the
Hmm.
way like the power that it is to do video and photos, like I know
Hmm.
it's hard to predict, but if you could put your, look into your crystal ball and give
Mm.
us some ideas of how this will change our lives. Because I think some people, it still feels more conceptual right now. Like, I don't know that a lot of people,
Hmm.
it doesn't, like, I like ChatGPT. I like playing around with it. I think it's cool. And I know there's a lot of other ways that you can
Hmm.
incorporate AI into, I read about one that helps to clean up your email inbox, that
Mm.
can help
Yeah.
filter out spam. And so, what are
Yeah.
other ways, like, in the next, yeah, what do you see now? And, like, how do you see in the future?
Yeah. So I think a couple things that we're already seeing, one is that customer service is really being taken over by AI. So, the chatbots that we all interact with are now powered by, more and more are powered by generative AI. Um, and, people in call centers are sort of gradually getting replaced by AI. Even at the drive-through, in my last job, one of the projects I had to work on was fast food ordering, AI for fast
Interesting.
food ordering. Yeah. Um, so I think that's a trend we're already seeing that will continue. Um, and then also, some forms of content creation, especially I think in art, we're seeing that like stock photography is increasingly being replaced by images that people generate using AI tools. Um, and I think, other types of content as well, like marketing emails.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that trend will continue. I think, I have a hard time predicting beyond that what's going to happen. And I think it's an open question in the field because, these models have a lot of problems, especially the large language models. They suffer from some pretty significant problems like the what's often called hallucination or confabulation, where they say things that just aren't true.
Mm.
And then also like intellectual property issues where they may spit out copyrighted material or they spit out code that doesn't, it's not accompanied by the proper license. And so because of those problems and other problems, I think it remains to be seen like really how useful are these things going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I just think about trying to get through what you need when you're chatting with one of those chatbots, and I'm just like,
Mhm.
representative,
Yes.
representative. Like, I need a
Yeah.
person. Like, it's always with Delta, and
Mhm.
I'm always just like, get me to an actual person because I
Yeah.
know that what I need you to do isn't something that you can do for me. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
like when you need to talk to a person, there's very little that can actually replace it, and so it
Yeah.
will be really interesting to see yeah, I mean, I
Mhm.
definitely worry about the future as a content creator and like
Mm,
working
yeah.
on, but I also think, yeah, there's just sometimes I hope that, the human touch and the human creativity, like I hope that we
Yeah.
can't fully replace that because there's
Hmm.
I think a lot about the artists and yeah, it's
Yeah.
an interesting time. It's an interesting
Hmm.
time we're living in. And so
For sure.
I wanted to end with asking about policy recommendations. And I know that
Hmm.
that's not 100%. You're on the other side a little bit more, but if you
Hmm.
had, yeah, like what from what you see, because I think it's really important that we work very closely with the scientific community on policy, whether
Hmm.
that's planning for how we are going to act on climate or planning for the future of these things. And so
Yeah.
what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, so I have a couple. So one of them relates to NIST, which is it's a federal agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So NIST has responsibility for developing guidelines and standards around the responsible use of AI, and they've done some really good work on this already. They developed an AI risk management framework that is highly respected. And then in the executive order that Biden issued last year on AI, they were given a lot more responsibility to build on the work they've done and build out more in terms of guidelines and recommendations on responsible use of AI. but they don't have sufficient funding to do that work.
Mm.
And so, what they've turned to as a result is this working group process where they've invited people from industry and academia and nonprofits to participate in these working groups. So, those working groups really will do the heavy lifting of shaping the recommendations. And so, that creates a situation where it's possible that big tech could have an outsized influence on the process. Simply because they have so many more resources, they can devote, full-time people to participating in these groups and contributing to them and shaping their recommendations. Um, and small nonprofits like mine that are trying to participate, we just find that we're not able to participate to the same extent because,
Mm.
we're volunteer driven and people have day jobs. It's difficult to contribute to the same extent. So um, I think that's not good for the public interest. And a simple solution would be to increase funding to that part of NIST that has this responsibility. So I think it's really feasible and something that should be done to make sure that this process, produces results that are in the public interest.
That I'll get to work on that right away, Carol. And what about
I,
oh, go ahead.
yeah. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is the environmental impact of AI, which is something we haven't touched on yet. Um, so especially the generative AI models are very energy hungry.
Mhm.
And also the data centers that run these models also use up a lot of water. And one of the things that we're seeing in various places around the country now is that coal-fired power plants that were scheduled to be decommissioned, now that's being delayed in a lot of places.
Mhm.
There's a need to keep these plants online to meet the expected increased energy demands due to AI workloads. Um, and we've been seeing a little of this in Utah as well. As you probably know, the
Yeah.
recent legislative session focused in part on keeping some of Utah's coal-fired power plants online longer. And one of the rationales given for that was increasing workloads due to AI. Yeah, in terms of a policy response, I don't think there's any easy answer here. But I think some of the things we could look at would be requiring environmental impact assessments for new data centers,
Mm.
or requiring new data centers to run on renewable energy, or maybe giving tax credits for those that add new renewable energy to the grid. Um, I'm not sure. And I think that we do need to be careful and, not do anything that would end up impeding American innovation or competitiveness in AI. But I think as a first step, we could put more resources into studying these problems. And that's something that the federal government would be in a good position to do. So fund studies on the environmental impact of data centers and start to work towards policy recommendations.
It's so interesting, and it's such a big issue right now as we're looking at 21st century grid integration too, and
Mm-hmm.
planning for the electrical and the energy needs of the 21st century and modernizing our electrical grid. And so
Mm-hmm.
the water and the energy use, the water part, especially here in the West where we're so arid.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you
Yeah.
for bringing that up. And yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to have an environmental assessment. And I also just, I watched a video AOC did last night just about her bill about the deep fake AI porn and how like
Mm.
90% of the generative video AI is used to make deep fake porn. And I'm like, we're
Mm.
using all this energy and
Yeah.
water to make fake porn. I'm like, this is crazy.
It is. Yes, that is
So I think
disappointing.
like there's a lot of ways that it could be used in a positive way for society. And like that is
Hmm.
especially concerning that so much of the energy is then being used to create these kind of exploitative images too that
Hmm.
sometimes target women and harass them. And yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think her legislation is really interesting. And again, why we need more millennials in Congress.
Mm.
Because yeah, we're just so underrepresented. And yeah, if we don't get ahead of these issues, I worry that they could get the better of us. And so to get more information, more funding, more research going, I really appreciate you taking the time. How can we follow and support your work?
Oh, probably the best thing is on LinkedIn. So I'm Carol M. Anderson on LinkedIn, and there's a link there also to my blog, but I'm not a very frequent blogger. So LinkedIn is the best.
Well, thank you so much for helping to educate and sharing your experience with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, and keep in touch.